And we're live. Well, Daniel Berends, thanks for joining us today. We're doing almost like a podcast form of this cluster for CCVT for youth and young adults, just to be able to finish off the series that we're in, which is the mental health series that we've been doing for the last few months. And I think we can both agree that this series is quite important. We know that we've had some really good reception from people that have been coming to the clusters and people who have listened to your wisdom and advice. So yeah, really good to round this three-part series of mental health with you in this sort of format. So how you going, Dan?
Yeah, good. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, pleasure, mate. Absolute pleasure. Now, for those who don't know, me and Dan have known each other for quite a little bit. Dan goes to my church. He's a psychologist, he's a practicing psychologist. In what suburb was it again, Dan?
Sorry?
Where are you practicing psychology again?
I'm in Lillydale.
Okay, awesome. No worries. And Dan's been with us, or I've had some great conversations with Dan around mental health issues, just because one of the things that you'll realise that when you get into a pastoral role and being a pastoral leader is that mental health doesn't discriminate between someone who maybe calls himself a spiritual person or a spiritual leader quote unquote common people as well. And so one of the things that we've noticed, and a lot of studies have noticed, that is pastors go through certain mental health issues. And you as a leader, you may, who are listening to this, you may recognise that in yourself or even the people that you've been, trained under or working with. And so what we want to do is we wanted to equip you as much as we possibly can around certain mental health issues, so that you have some tools and wisdom to tackle these issues and to just be prepared pretty much. So that's why we did this series, and that's why we're rounding it off with Dan today with a few questions. And it's going to be an awesome time. What do you reckon, Dan?
Yeah, should be good.
Awesome, mate. Cool. Well, how about we start off with a few questions and then we can sort of go from there. So the first one is, how do you recognise mental health issues in church, like amongst pastors, but also amongst the congregants there as well?
Yeah, I suppose the defining feature of most mental illnesses is people struggling.
Yep.
Most diagnostic criteria have the common criteria that it's causing a deficit in function, and whether that's socially, educationally, occupationally, so you'll have people that come in, and if you know them, you might notice that they're probably a little bit more down, they're less enthusiastic, they might be more enthusiastic in some cases, depending on, whether it's what condition it is. Essentially you're just seeing a change in people that is making them essentially struggle to do what they used to do. Yeah, so sure. That's the broadest sense you could give. So if you're looking at something like depression, generally you're noticing people start to lose a sense of hope, motivation. We talk about depression as like the opposite of a sense of competency and mastery.
Yeah, right. I think that's really important that you said that, because sometimes we just think that depression is just a low mood. But can you actually just give us that definition again of what you'd say depression is?
Yeah, well, low mood is a necessary criteria for diagnosing depression, but it is only one of a list of about 9. So right. These other things include things like sleeping too much or too little, dietary changes, so eating too much or too little. The low mood, loss of motivation, irritability is one people don't expect. So particularly men in Australia, a key sign of depression is actually anger and irritability.
Yeah, right.
So that's one not people don't necessarily associate with depression. So yes, while you're looking for someone that is, feeling down, you're not necessarily looking for them to be sad all the time. They're just, I suppose you're looking at them not being themselves. You're looking for them withdrawing from interactions, perhaps not turning up for sessions they volunteer for or whatever they're rostered on for. So or they start talking about how they feel like they're no good at things, how they feel worthless, and sense of hopelessness, and that is another symptom.
Yeah, and so you're saying so sometimes we can recognise what depression is by recognising what the opposite of it is. And you're saying someone with the opposite of depression is someone who's full of purpose, full of motivation, ready to go, ready to tackle life. Mm-hmm. And so, because I think you and I had a bit of a chat, or we've had quite a few chats, and sometimes depression can just look like numbness, like just not having any drive or motivation for anything, and everything sort of lost its taste a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing as well. Like, to a lot of people, when they talk about having depression, like they say it's not about just feeling sad all the time. They say it's about feeling nothing.
Yeah, well,
This numbness that a lot of people describe. And I think an important thing, to sort of counter part of what you just said there about the opposite is people who feel driven and feel motivated and all that sort of thing. Just because someone is showing all those things, particularly in public, doesn't mean they can't be depressed.
yeah,
So I
right.
think it's important to sort of have that relationship with people, because people could be coming and showing that motivation, that drive and all this sort of thing in public, where they can hold it together for that little bit of time and then fall apart when they're behind the scenes. So having that relationship with people is important. I mean, examples like this is like, say, Buddy Franklin.
Yep.
Buddy Franklin came out a few years ago as having quite severe anxiety and depression, but you'd never notice it watching him play football.
Right.
So I suppose if you're looking at a leader or a volunteer or someone, they could, be holding it together for a few hours on a Sunday to come and help out. But if you notice that they're not coming to meetings, or they're not doing that social stuff, or they're starting to avoid doing things, and yeah, that's also possibly a sign as well.
And it can come out as in the way they speak about things as well, doesn't it? So there could be some telltale signs around their language that's indicating that they may be depressed, and maybe they're not aware of it of themselves, but as a leader, it might be well within your capacity to pay attention to the language that people are speaking as well, about their life, their calling and all that kind of thing. Because I can tell you, when you get into pastoral leadership, it's all about passion. It's all about motivation. It's all about calling. We rarely get into pastoral roles for money.
There's not that much to go around.
Yeah, that's right. Excuse me. And so when we do get into pastoral roles, it's about that motivation. It's about chasing after what God's will for you is. And then when you sort of get into the role, we realize there are hard things that come down the line. And you look at the statistics of how many people burn out and how many people suffer depression in the pastoral role. It's quite astounding. And so I think it's really important just to be able to know that, firstly, if we don't take a priority in taking care of ourselves, and really doing that work of feeding yourself and giving you that rest and rejuvenation, and giving your mind just as much attention as you would your body, I guess, it can really sort of creep up on you after a while.
Yeah. And like you're saying, the language there is the important thing. So someone who comes in and they're talking mostly about problems, they're talking about stress, like we know that depression makes people focus on the negative.
Right.
So, or even switching things around, like learning something, like there's the negative attribution bias. So someone with depression who succeeded at something, people congratulate them, and in their head they turn around and say, like, all these circumstantial factors were the reason for that. It wasn't them. So you'll see that, almost instead of shifting the blame, they're shifting the success in some ways. So which can come across as humility, which makes it very hard to detect in some ways. But then, you're talking, they talk about, being hopeless when they're being overly negative about a lot of things. Like, you might want to just check in and just see how they're feeling.
Yeah. Well, I think that's really important, because we are in a community that affirms a lot. I know in our church there's communities, and I know there's communities where that's not necessarily the case, but when you do have language around when you're being affirmed and you just don't know how to take that, or I think what you just said then about deferring success rather than blame is a good way of actually putting it. And it actually does mask itself as humility, but it may be something a bit more than that, I guess, or a bit deeper than that. Was cool.
Yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about depression, but that's I guess one aspect of mental health. What about things like anxiety? Like, what is it about what people like? What are the telltale signs that people might be showing when they're experiencing high levels of anxiety? Why do we have anxiety? How do we spot it in people, and how do we go ahead and try to bring our anxiety levels down?
Right. Well, I suppose there's an entire session there, and we kind of did one earlier on the video sessions a couple of weeks ago. It was like, so anxiety is sort of kind of on the mental illness sort of direction. You could look at it as the opposite of depression. So depression is worried about the past. You're concerned about the past and what's happened, and anxiety is worrying about the future. And we always say that, and between the two, you're sort of missing what's going on right now, which we can get to later. But so anxiety is essentially a safety mechanism. Like we talked about in the session we did with some of the guys, that anxiety is your brain trying to keep you safe. I like to say that our brains developed to keep us safe, not happy. right? And what that is that, you know, there's tigers in the bushes and all you've got is a stick and a rock. Being worried about what could possibly be coming that you don't know about keeps you alive. You know, it makes you leave. So anxiety is something that is there to try and convince you to leave a situation because it detects that it's unsafe. The problem is that, as we've said, we don't have tigers anymore. We now have deadlines and social media and all these other things that your brain still detects as a threat to yourself. So anxiety is your brain trying to keep you safe from things it determines as a threat that are either real or perceived.
Right.
So you talk about people with anxiety, they're never anxious about something good happening. And knowing what's actually going to happen lowers anxiety. So usually it's about unknowns.
Right.
Right. And usually the unknown gears towards the negative. So if there's a positive option, someone with anxiety is probably not going to think of that. They're going to attach to what the negative idea is, because looking forward to, think of it like this. If you're looking forward to the positive thing and the positive thing doesn't happen, that's a hit.
Yep.
Right. That's a punch in the guts. No one likes that. So to avoid that, your brain assumes the negative is going to happen and tries to think you will be prepared for it.
Right.
So anxiety is worrying about stuff in the future, and that can manifest as, you know, raised heart rate. You know, your mind starts racing because you start thinking of all the things that could go wrong.
Yeah.
You know, everything from clammy sweats, shaking, people having full-blown panic attacks. So that's, I suppose, the very basic behavioral idea of anxiety, right?
Yeah, you said, to put it in really practical terms, you know, sometimes I get emails around where people say, "Hey Ben, can we have a chat?"
Yes. Your open chat.
Yeah, and as a pastor, that brings like this, like I don't know what to expect, because it brings like a bit of a dread in the pit of my stomach when I get emails like that.
Yeah, totally. And so, what are you expecting there?
Well, like it depends on from whom. Like when it's one of my mates who I know that usually comes to me with good news, I'm like, oh, actually there's a bit of anticipation there. However, if it's someone that I don't really know, or some person who the track record has just been bad news after bad news after bad news, the anxiety levels sort of go up. But I've noticed as well that when it comes to my, I guess, authorities, people that are above me, when things like that are said, I automatically go to the negative. I say, oh, what have I done wrong? Or what am I going to get checked on, kind of thing. So what are your thoughts on that, and how can we improve communication?
So this is a really common thing, because you get that email, you get that text messages like, hey, we need to chat, and your assumption is always going to be, oh no, I'm going to get sacked, dumped, they're going to say I did something that hurt them, and like you said, you're going through all those negative things. So I suppose the best thing to that is sort of just be wary when we do it ourselves as well. Like, I've told leaders and volunteers before, if you need to talk to someone, include a general idea of what you want to talk about. So it's not like, hey, we need to chat. It's like, hey, Ben, I want to chat with you about doing this interview thing that we were going to talk about. Or, hey, let's talk about that volunteer workshop. Or, you don't have to go into the great detail. Yeah, so I suppose when we get those dreaded messages, what we're expecting is the negative. We're expecting we're going to get dumped, we're going to get fired, we're going to get told off. Your brain isn't going to what positive things could be happening, like you said, unless you have that relationship already. So what we can do about that is we're trying to avoid talking about all the details of what we want to say. We're trying to just do a quick message to let someone know we want to talk. What we want to do is actually just give a very brief idea of like, hey, Ben, can we chat about that? That interview we want to organize. Can we talk about doing that workshop with the volunteers? Can we, we want to talk about, you want to give the person an idea of what they're saying so that they can rule out all the negative things.
Yeah, I think it's such an important wisdom piece there, because I can't tell you how many times I've felt like this kind of like pit in the stomach kind of feeling, like, oh, what's going to be said. And it's just like, hey, I was thinking of buying a birthday cake. Can I get your opinion on it? It's just like, the whole day you're worrying about stuff. But it's not even a big
deal.
In
the stomach, that's the survival mechanism, like that's your anxiety telling you, oh no, this thing's going to be bad. And it's trying to make you feel uncomfortable about it. So you don't go to that meeting. You don't want to do that chat.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then what you'll find, the difficult thing with anxiety is that it's self-reinforcing, right?
Yep.
People that don't want to go to a party, like say something like social anxiety, they think, oh, people are going to judge me. People are going to think I'm weird. People are going to think I look weird. So they start having that awkward feeling, that pit in the stomach. And so they're like, nah, I don't want to feel like this. So they ring up and cancel the party, or they ring up and say they're not going. The moment they hang up that phone, that feeling goes away.
Yep.
And that feeling going away reinforces that not going to the party was the right thing to do.
Yep.
Right? So you're training your body and you're training your brain to follow through that pattern.
Right.
Right?
Yep. Yeah, I've noticed this. I've noticed this pattern in the young adults community. So I'm a young adults pastor for those who are listening that don't know Discovery Church. And what I noticed was that there were quite a few young adults arriving to church. Our church start time is 5 p.m. Arriving to church about 5:05 or 5:10, just when the first worship song started, and then they'd leave just before the message or the session would end, the night would end. And I was always wondering like why that was. I thought, oh, these people are really committed. Like, why would they want to do that? Why do they not want to get connected in? And it became pretty evident to me it was social anxiety. Like the idea of standing out in a room and talking to people and having small chit chat before a service isn't everyone's idea of heaven or social heaven. Some people are quite anxious about that experience, anxious about having to come up with conversation, anxious about not knowing who to sit next to and things like that. So what they'd rather do is to come in later so they don't have to talk to anyone, get into the service, tick it off, and then just get out of there as quick as possible. And I thought to be like, I can understand it, but it also poses a problem as well. Like, how do you, if you have that sort of social anxiety, how do you, obviously it's a hurdle to relationships and building new relationships. How do you go about attempting to tackle that hurdle?
Yeah, well, I suppose from an individual level, so I practice something when I work clinically called acceptance and commitment therapy.
Sure.
And the way that works is based on the idea that, like you're saying, the idea of social anxiety, it's, as an example, is that it's not the anxiety itself that's causing the distress. Someone isn't coming in going like, oh, I want to get therapy because I feel this pit in my stomach every time I think of doing something social. They're not saying, oh, every time I walk into church, I feel like my heart rate starts going. What they're saying is, I want therapy because I'm missing out on friendships, because I'm avoiding going to church at times when I have to talk to people. Like, it's the avoidance, it's the ways we try and maladaptively deal with that feeling. It's the way we maladaptively deal with the disorder is what causes the actual distress.
Sure.
Right? So maladaptive is simply a word to say that, it's a way of, there's adapting, there is a way of changing to adapt to a situation. Maladaptive is adapting to a situation in a way that is actually less functional.
Right. There you go.
Right. So in acceptance commitment therapy, what we do is we talk about the idea of, yes, you're going to feel anxious, you're going to have that pit in your stomach, and you're going to go to the thing anyway.
Yep.
Right, so you're accepting that the anxiety is there. You're not trying to fight it, because fighting it takes effort. Fighting it takes energy. It takes your focus. You can't concentrate on what someone else is talking to you about when you're focusing on the fact that you don't want to have a raised heart rate. You don't want to feel that pit in your stomach. Sure. It's distracting and it's making you want to avoid things. So accepting that you're going to have that feeling anyway leads people to be able to still do what they want to do, and eventually that situation that becomes less anxiety provoking.
Yeah.
So you're reconditioning. So going to church on time and talking to people and finding somewhere to sit, it teaches you like, hey, you can have this feeling, go in and you survive.
Yep.
And eventually your brain learns that this is not a threat.
Okay. I mean, I can completely resonate with what you're saying. As a pastor, I'm called to preach a lot in a consistent basis. And I can tell you, I still get quite nervous, speaking in front of a few hundred people in our church. And, there's probably not been one time when I've just felt really good. I always come to these things going, oh, I feel a little, I get that pit in the stomach kind of feel, like I get anxious, I get nervous, but I push through anyway. And I've come to realize that these things are just going to be there. They're not necessarily things that need to be my master to say whether I should do something or not. It's just accepting the fact that they're always going to be there. And what it turns out to be is when I use these feelings, or when I accept the fact that they're there and then go ahead and do it anyway and speak and preach and do it, what I believe guided by the Holy Spirit, I always come away feeling great because something's been accomplished despite the fact that everything inside me was saying, don't do it kind of thing, or this is too nerve wracking, or, I'm feeling kind of anxious. So it definitely resonates with you, what you're saying.
Yeah, and I think it can be kind of a pitfall as well. Like, just interestingly, as a side note, and I think we've talked about this as well, is that these sort of feelings, like in a spiritual community, like a church, it can be problematic because people can have these feelings and they can interpret it as like the spirit trying to tell them something.
Right.
Right? They can hear something that makes them feel uncomfortable, and they can start interpreting it as like, oh, this is God trying to tell me that this thing is
wrong. Yeah.
And avoid it, and that can cause problems as well. So I think as a spiritual community, it's helpful to also be understanding of what mental illness is like, what it does to people's minds and what it does to how people feel, so that we can actually work in a helpful way of dealing with it.
Yeah, definitely. Now, speaking of that as well and helping people, I've been put in positions where at times as a spiritual leader, people come to me with issues that I'm just not qualified to deal with. When it comes to spiritual issues, definitely. When it comes to meditating on the word, praying for people, teaching people and discipling people around spiritual things, for sure. I think I've got competency around that sort of thing. But if someone came to me with a broken arm, I would by no means start surgery on them. I'd actually send them to a doctor. Now, the same thing with mental health issues. When someone comes to me with something like severe depression, obviously I can pray for them. Obviously I can show them the spiritual side of things. But what do I do as a pastor when I'm confronted with these situations? What are the best steps as a pastor? What's a wisdom for a pastor when you are confronted with issues where people who do have severe mental health issues come to you to be someone who they're expected to save them out of this situation?
Well, I think, you've sort of hit a few things on the head. I think one of the important things, and the wisdom of it is, I feel like that analogy in the Bible of the body. The foot can't say to the eye, I don't need you. The eye can't say to the hand, I don't need you, right? So we need to accept as pastors as well, you aren't a jack of all trades. Right? I'm not a pastor. I don't feel like I can get up and, teach biblically scholarly things. I feel like I have a pretty good theological grounding, but that's not my expertise. So I feel like part of it is a pastor having the humility and also the vulnerability for themselves to accept that they don't have to have the answers.
Yep.
And that can be hard, because I think a lot of Christians and pastors, particularly isolated pastors, if you're in a smaller church and you're one of the only real leadership person in an area, you kind of feel like you have to be the person with the answers. Right? It's sort of an intrinsic thing we take on. Like, if I don't have the answers, then who does? And then, you feel like people are going to lose faith and trust in you, and anxiety kicks in.
That's right.
Right? That's anxiety provoking for pastors, to feel like people are going to think they're incompetent. And, we call it imposter syndrome. Right? Yeah. Incredibly prone in pastors, doctors, psychologists, right? Anyone in a caring thing, like when you feel like you have to be the person that has the answers.
Yep.
And part of the role, I think, is to accept and acknowledge when you don't have the answers. And like you said, figuring out that, okay, so what do we do instead? And I think that is the best part the church can play, is that you're right. People will come to churches to seek help. Right? We know that in Australia, the numbers are 1 in 5 people in the general community will suffer a mental illness at some stage in their life. Right? 1 in 3 if you're women.
Well,
right? And I reckon those numbers are higher in churches, because churches are a place where people come to get help.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
That's the stereotype of a church. It's somewhere you come. And realistically, churches can help, but I feel like facilitating someone finding good help is part of the church.
Yep.
Right? This is my thing. Like, the church, saying that the church can't fix someone's mental illness is not saying the church has no part in supporting mental illness.
Yeah.
The church is meant to be support, not treatment.
Sure.
Right? So I think, trying to lose track of what your questions were there, like, as far as what you do, like the next step. So the joy and the beauty of living in Australia is we have Medicare.
Yep.
Right? And what we have there is called a mental health care plan. And anyone can go to a GP, say, look, I'm struggling with XYZ, and I think I need a mental health care plan. Generally, most GPs prefer you have an idea of what psychologist you want to go to. So you have a list of clinics or something, and they write a letter and a referral, and that gives you, once you take out the technicalities, 10 Medicare rebated psychology sessions. Right?
Yeah, okay.
So anyone can go get one of those. And that gives a Medicare rebate on psychology sessions, because cost is a big thing for a lot of people, but it also makes sure that someone also is getting effective, qualified help for what they're doing.
Yep.
Right? Now, the issue there that some churches come across is they feel like they're offloading, but the reality is that the church is still a supportive place.
Yep.
Right? Now, when we did a workshop with our volunteers a few weeks ago, I went over the fact that you think of all the protective factors of mental health, like research-based things that are considered protective factors for good mental health, include supportive social circles, right? Purpose and meaning in life, engagement and belonging, right? Being able to contribute to a group, right? And belief in a God who cares is one of them as well. Now, if you ask me, every single one of those things should be available in church.
Yep.
So while a church can't be the one doing the therapy, a church can't be the one giving someone the skills necessarily to deal with their anxiety or their depression or bipolar or whatever is going on, but you can offer all those things, right? And when treating someone, what I ask is, what social life do you have? What social supports do you have? Where are you getting support other than just coming here and seeing me for an hour?
Yep.
Right? Because people need that support.
Yep.
And a church is a great place to get that.
No, that's awesome. Yep. No, it's great. I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, and there's a lot of things to chew over and think about that sort of thing, because I do feel that there are people who are probably experiencing the fact that they have to be a savior to people that, they can easily refer to. And again, like, we are qualified as pastors in spiritual things. We're qualified in theology. We are qualified in what things to meditate upon and the truths that do set us free and all that kind of stuff as well. But I think what you said about the body was just so important, that we need to be humble enough to know that, yes, God has put in our culture and our society things and measures to help health be available to everyone. Now, for me, I want to make sure that I'm not just only seeking help or looking at measures when I'm in a hole or I'm in a ditch or where I'm too far down a way where my mental health is really suffering. I actually want to do things to make sure I'm on top of my mental health. Mm-hmm. What would you say would be good practices, I guess you could say, for pastors and people in church to stay on top of their mental health and just have the most mentally healthy life that they possibly can have?
Yeah. Well, I think, we always say prevention is better than the cure. And one of the great things that's come out of, what we call positive psychology in the last few years is the idea of, let's not just focus on what are the factors affecting someone who is mentally ill. Let's look at the people who are mentally healthy and see what's different there.
Yeah, well.
And that's called positive psychology. And what is coming out of that is the idea that it's not about thinking positively. Right? People think, positive thinking, like, you got something going wrong, just look for the bright side. And that's actually not really the case. Like, trying to insist on looking at positive everywhere can actually be more damaging. So one of the important things is simply taking time to feel what you're at. So one is not trying to suppress hurt, not trying to suppress emotion or stress, and actually, being willing to get help is the first thing.
Yep.
Like, getting out, you don't have to be in a full-blown episode of depression, anxiety, or psychosis and that to get help from a psychologist. You can go see someone or a counselor because you feel like you're being under the pump.
Yep.
Right? Go get some preventative measures in place, and then you can also learn skills there that fit into your context of how you can help do that and de-stress. And because stress is a big factor that I was going to talk about next, because, everything is a function of stress, essentially. Right?
Yeah.
So when we think about what the idea of how do we support ourselves, it's what do you do to de-stress?
Right.
So that's where we're going with this. It's things like having someone to talk to, getting rest, having times that you enjoy, self-care.
Yeah.
Right. So it's just what do you do for the sake of enjoying it?
Yeah.
Right? That's what I find important, and I encourage people to do. It's not about, hey, let's do this thing because my psychologist told me I had to. It's not about, hey, let's do this thing because this is going to, improve my mental health. It's what do you just enjoy doing? Is it painting? Is it going for a walk in the bush? Is it bike riding? Like, all those sort of things. So being able to just find something that lowers your stress levels is really important.
That's awesome. Can you talk to us a little bit about stress and the threshold of stress? I know you kind of touched on it in one of our earlier sessions, but would you be able to just for this session to talk about what it means for stress to arise in us, and then what actually happens when there's a threshold that you go through when it comes to stress as well?
Yeah, well, it's easier to do in visuals, but essentially what happens is that everyone has a threshold somewhere, right? Everyone has the amount of stuff they're able to cope with, right? Think of it as a bucket, right? Everyone has a bucket, and you can only fit so much stuff in a bucket. Now, depending on people's life circumstances, where they're at, what their experiences are, everyone's bucket can be different sizes, and everyone's bucket fills up at different rates.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's important to recognize what is stressful for one person may not be stressful for another. And if something isn't stressful for you, doesn't mean it's not stressful for someone else. So individual experience is really important in mental health. So what happens is when a bad thing happens, when stressful things happen, the bucket gets filled.
Yep.
Right? The line on the graph goes up, so to speak, when we look at the visual. So, and then as you get closer and closer to the threshold, you start to sort of struggle and waver, and your ability to cope with situations starts to get harder. And then once that bucket is full, your coping mechanisms don't work anymore, right? You've reached the limit of what you were able to cope with, and that's when you enter what we would call an episode. So that's when things like depression, anxiety, when things get bad and people start to lose the ability to deal with day-to-day life things.
Right.
Right.
So what you're saying, the undergirding of things like depression and anxiety is stress. Is that what you're saying?
Well, stress in a broad term of things that happen that we don't like and that aren't good.
Right.
Right. So stress is a very general term for essentially stressors, things that aren't going right. So our ability to cope with these things is limited, and everyone has a limit. Like we're saying, Buddy Franklin, it doesn't discriminate. People that are rich, people that are successful, people that have everything they could ever want still reach this threshold.
Yep.
So it's susceptible to everyone. And then the best thing we can do to keep ourselves from, overflowing and having that breakdown is to empty the bucket. And you empty the bucket by doing things that you enjoy, by having positive experiences, by taking time out and resting.
Wow.
Yeah.
I think that's so important, because especially when you talk about pastors and their work ethic and the things that they've committed themselves to, generally, I mean, as you talk to a pastor, generally what they'll say is how much they love what they're doing. And so they do love what they're doing, but it seems as though that they don't give themselves enough time to be able to recharge and refresh. The role of a pastor and a pastoral leader is to give out. That's effectively what it is. And so people come to you expecting that you're going to give something out to them, whether it's love, wisdom, encouragement, support, whatever it might be. There's always a taking out effect, or a lot of the time there's a taking out effect. There's not very much infilling effect that just comes automatically. So with a job, what's automatic is you're outgoing, not necessarily the infilling. Now, I will say it is very, very filling to be able to do what God's called you to do. But in the same sense, it seems as though sometimes a recreation, rest, and doing something fun might be like a cop-out or an excuse to just waste time. And I think that's something that I think we really need to focus on. What I would perceive as a lie, that those things are, for all intents and purposes, you're being lazy or something like that, and really they're actually the fundamental building blocks of your longevity in the pastoral role. And so, and to get people to understand the fact that yes, rest and recreation are created by God just as much as work, diligence, and commitment is, to keep you going and to keep you growing. Yeah, totally. And I think, like when we come back to a point you made earlier about, that it's about the outpouring, and that's hard when you get, pastors get that good feedback, that's, you give to your community, you do this thing, like that's what you get told you're good at. So you want to keep doing it. And then that infilling becomes difficult because you don't necessarily get good feedback for that. And like you're saying, you get those messages saying, hey, we need to talk. And usually that's from someone that feels like they're not getting enough out of you. Part of a caring profession like pastoring and psychology and counseling. And, it's when people are complaining, it's not just complaining about what you do, they're complaining about, we feel like they're complaining about who you are. Yeah, right. That's a big hit. So that outpouring is a big part that we feel like we need to do that in order to feel like we're being useful or we're being successful at what we do. But that, like you're saying, that
inpouring as well is also important.
Yeah.
And saying like, you know, oh, I love what I do doesn't necessarily mean it's not a stressful thing, because you know, you don't just stop. Like, we're all really terrible at leaving what we do at the door. You know, it's a 24/7 thing. You're thinking about the person you're caring for when you go home. You're thinking about that situation that you're pastorally looking after.
Yeah.
You know, so even if you love what you do, it still can be a stressor. And so that taking a break, taking the time to do something just for the sake of doing it is important. And the other thing that's important when you're talking about self-care and that is also having that support.
Yes.
You know? Having someone you can talk to offload a few things, and the bucket gets bigger the more support you have. Right? This is why we say having a supportive community and encouragement and belonging in a church is a protective factor, because people who feel they belong and people who feel they are supported have a higher threshold. They can cope with more because there's other people to share the load.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really important to know as well to have friends outside of your workspace. I think with pastors, because we care for so many people and we love people, you know, like we as leaders, we love people, we love raising up people. But there does seem this sense of you lose those friends where you can just be totally brutally raw, authentic and honest with.
Yeah.
And you lose those sort of deep connections that become fewer and fewer. And I guess we sort of almost like kind of trick ourselves saying, oh, look, you know, I'm caring for so many people, but they're not actually those friends that are kind of like on the same level as you, where you can say, whatever you want to, kind of thing. And I think those type of friends are so important, to have those sort of deep connections where you don't have to think about ministry, you don't have to think about work, you don't have to think about, you can just have fun and goof off and be, you know, be silly, or, you know, or have those serious conversations, and you know that you're not going to get judged. But the whole issue there is the deep connection. And I guess one of the things that I ask myself is, how many of those do I have outside of the pastoral role and work, because it's so important. And I think that's probably one of the biggest reasons why people do silly things in ministry as well, because, you know, there is this sort of isolating factor when you become a leader, where people are looking to you for answers and you feel as though you've got to walk alone. And so what happens is when that happens in your church, but also happens in your family life as well, that's when leaders start making silly decisions. They start making decisions on, oh, this person understands me more than maybe my wife or husband does, and actions that ensue out of that. So it is so important to make sure that your bucket gets emptied and then it gets refreshed and filled with good connections with friends and family outside of the church area as well. I just think that's so important.
Yeah, and I think that's something you're saying there, is that the when we talk about, even in psychology, counseling, pastors and all that sort of thing, when you look at those sort of ethical issues and incidents that happen, 90% of them, when you look at the details, are people who haven't looked after their own stuff.
Yeah.
Right? They have their own stuff going in the background and feeling like they're the helping person. They're the one that everyone else comes to. They either feel like they don't have anyone else to go to, or they feel like they shouldn't have to have anyone else to go to.
Yeah. Well,
you know, we will find other things that make us feel better.
Yep.
Right? And those things can be maladaptive. So I think absolutely getting help for yourself is a big thing. And I think even as a psychologist, I had to learn this, that, you know, every psychologist should have a psychologist.
Yeah, well.
Right? So every pastor should have a pastor.
Well.
Right? Just someone you can offload to, someone you can talk to about it. And that's part of the self-care. It's that supportive circle, knowing that you have someone that you can go to, that you're not going to feel like you're judged by.
Yeah. There's definitely so much wisdom in that. And I think it's not one of those things where it's like, oh, it's optional. I think it just needs to be like mandatory that people do that sort of thing. And just because of what we've seen in the past and the effects of not having that in your life as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dan, I just want to loop back a little bit. We've got a few more minutes with you. Now, you're talking about anxiety and depression. The way that you framed it was, depression basically is your fear of the past, or your regret of the past, or mainly focusing your mind on the past. And you said that anxiety is more around the fear of the future, the unknown. Now, Jesus says something pretty interesting. He says, do not worry about the future, or think about it, but stay in the present. Think about today, because today's got enough troubles of its own. Can you speak to possibly what you know about the power of being in the present?
Yeah. Well, it's like I was saying, the basis of this whole act as we call it, acceptance commitment therapy, is the idea that the distressing part about depression is the regret. So regret and worry are pretty much the two ways you could look at it.
Yeah.
And it's how we try to deal with that. And the problem is that we can't change the past. It's happened and we can't do it. We may feel regret about it, but we can't change it. So trying to focus on what we regret isn't going to help. And any other way we try and change it is going to lead to more distress.
Yeah. Well.
And then anxiety is worry about the future, right? We're worrying about what negative thing is going to happen in the future. The problem is that the future hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
Right? Now, yes, different to depression, we could try and change the future. Right? But ultimately, the future is still subject to so many different variables. We actually can't necessarily control everything that happens. And we don't know what's going to happen. Yes, it could be terrible, but it could also be really good.
Yeah.
So in our efforts to avoid what happens in the future, we cause ourselves more distressed, right? Pretty sure there's whole scenes in Kung Fu Panda about this.
Yeah.
But yeah, like you're saying, Jesus is saying, like, today has enough worries of its own. So the idea of acceptance, and one of the key tenets, if you will, of acceptance commitment is the idea of being in the present moment. Because all we have is the present moment, right? We can't change the past. We can't really control the future. So when we focus on the present, we focus on what we have now. We focus on what we have in front of us. We focus on what we can do. And then the point comes in of actually just making a choice of what direction you want to move in, because you can't control everything else.
Yeah, well.
So part of it is like acceptance. People think of acceptance as resignation, right? Particularly when you start thinking about disability and mental illness and stuff, people think, oh, to accept it, like, you're just giving up, you're just losing faith. It's like, well, no, acceptance isn't resignation. Acceptance is accepting that things are the way they are and trying to decide what you can do from now.
Yeah, well.
Right?
Yeah, well, that's really important. I think that's really powerful as well, especially when it comes to, look, it's really empowering to not think about the past and not think about the future, because you literally you've got no control over the past. And you, like you said, you don't know what's coming down the line. But for today, I think I feel as though, to put it in a spiritual way, and more in a pastoral way, I guess you could say, I feel as though God gives us our daily bread, which means he gives us grace for today. He hasn't given you grace for tomorrow. He hasn't given you, and the past is already gone. And, you can look at that through the lens of grace as well. I think that's a good way of looking at your life, through the lens of God's love and his grace. But today you've been given grace, you've been given power, you've been given strategy, you've been given communion with the Holy Spirit and direction. And today you tackle life as much as you can today with God's power. And that's how you live life. You don't live life by worrying about the future. It paralyzes you in the present. And by paralyzing you in the present, it creates a future that you don't want anyway. So it's like,
that's avoidance.
It's avoidance, that's right. Yeah. So I just think that's such a powerful thing. And maybe, as you're listening to this and you want to know what you can get out of that, or get out of this sort of meeting, I think that's probably one of the biggest things is to live in the now. And do you feel as though you have seen, when people apply that, an improvement in their ability to deal with life?
Well, yeah. I mean, even like in a research basis, like, there's hundreds of studies now on acceptance commitment therapy and other acceptance-based and mindfulness-based interventions about how they can improve people's level of distress.
Yeah, well.
So yeah, absolutely. It's evidence-based. And I think even in my own work, it's about, you see people realize they can't change the past, but focusing on the past as well isn't bringing them any happiness or joy. And what we do is, like, you work with, okay, what is a person's values? Right? And values is a very important part of what I do as well. And I think everyone should be aware of what their values are, because what happens is, when we come to a point where we find that depression or anxiety or just stress in general is leading us down a path we don't want to go down, where we're starting to experience that distress, you kind of use your values as a guide. You go, okay, so what decision can I make now that is going to lead me in the direction I want to go?
Yeah.
And part of that, bringing you into the present moment, gives you the space to deal with that. Because if you're worrying about the future, what you're thinking about is, well, what do I have to do to avoid this thing? What do I have to do to avoid this thing? You're focusing on the future, and you're focusing on what you might possibly have to do to react to things that haven't happened yet.
Yep.
Whereas right now you have a choice, right? Do you go down the left road? Do you go down the right road? Which one is going to lead you in the direction you want?
Yeah.
And by focusing on the now, focusing on what you have immediately, that's really powerful. And yeah, I have seen that in different ways. And I think, you know, we've talked before, and I said in the other sessions we had about the great answer to all psychological questions is it depends.
Yeah.
And I think this is the thing, like it will be a different impact for different people, but in general, yes, like you see acceptance and seeing people let go of the struggle is something I find amazing. And it's really, when I learned this sort of stuff around acceptance when I was doing my master's in clinical psych, this is where I really clicked that this is the gospel in psych speak.
Yeah, wow.
Like I said, you're looking at people let go of the struggle, you're looking at people let go of their regret of the past and their worry about the future, and you're seeing this emphasis on living as if you're loved now.
Wow.
Right. So I think, and that's an entire session we could talk about in ourselves, but yeah. But yeah, that's, I think the basis of acceptance is it. That is the gospel.
Yeah. Wow. Hey mate, if people wanted to know a little bit more about this ACT, acceptance commitment theory, therapy, sorry, where would you go? Where would you go to find something?
Well, there's a few really good books written for sort of, non-clinically trained sort of, in lack of a better word, layman's term sort of things. And it's by a guy named Ross Harris. And he's a fantastic guy. He was a medical doctor, became counsellor, and has sort of become one of the gurus of ACT in Australia. And I understand, sort of sitting here feeling like I'm proselytizing ACT for people in itself. But I feel like he's written a book called The Happiness Trap.
Sure.
And he wrote a book called The Reality Slap.
Okay.
And they both sort of tackle different aspects of it, but they're also really good, really simple to read. And I think just also being able to read the Bible with that idea in mind that it is about acceptance and it is about, like I said, we could probably go into an entire series of this, but I think those books are a good start. And think of the gospel while you're reading it. Think of the things Jesus said. Think of what the Bible says about forgiveness and grace and mercy and kind of the stress we put ourselves in when we regret what we've done. It really just meshes so well as it excites me when I read something in an ACT book or I read something therapeutically and I'm like, wow, that just sounds like the gospel. And then I read something in the Bible and I'm like, wow, that sounds like ACT.
Yeah.
It's really incredible how well it meshes. But I think other than that, I think for people who want to be interested in what they can do about mental illness and what they can understand, because I feel separate to, all the acceptance stuff, I feel just understanding mental illnesses is the solution to a lot of issues the church faces.
Yeah. Right.
We talk about a lot of churches try to deal with mental illness, like short of sending them to a professional, how you deal with mental illness is important, because what we think, how a normal brain acts when it's healthy, and we think, we do this with the best of intentions, telling people something can actually be switched around if someone isn't actually thinking in their best space.
Right.
Best of intentions aren't always the most effective. Right? Yeah. People telling someone with depression like, but you have Jesus, you should feel happy. So, that's telling someone, because you have Jesus, you can feel happy. What someone with depression might hear is, well, if I'm not feeling happy, then I mustn't have Jesus.
Yeah, sure.
Right? So you see how quickly that turns. So understanding that sort of thing. So I think looking up sites like Lifeline, Beyond Blue, I think even for youth and young adults, the Kids Helpline website has an amazing amount of resources and fact sheets on different mental illnesses.
Yeah.
And the Raising Children Network or Raising Kids Network is another government-supported website, and that again has a whole lot of fact sheets that you can go to. And it can be a bit of a rabbit warren, but it does give you a lot of really good, usable, easy-ish to digest information about that. And of course, finding someone in your community that is able to come and help you understand these things is also great. I mean, it's what I'm trying to do at our church and other churches. So if anyone wants to contact me as well, that's perfectly fine.
Amazing. Yeah. Amazing, mate. Well, thank you so much for your wisdom and your time, mate. And for those who are listening and you want to know a little bit more, feel free to email me and I can, get Daniel to give some resources if you need to know anything more around the ACT and just recognising mental health in your leadership and the places that you lead. Obviously, it's such an important topic. As we see the research coming out and the data that's coming out, more and more people are identifying with mental health issues. But I think it's also a great thing to know that the gospel has an answer. As Dan touched on, when he reads the ACT things, he sees the gospel in it. And so I would just say, really appreciative of your time, Dan. Thank you so much for investing into us. And I hope that as you listen to this, that you apply the things that you've heard. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to get in contact with us. And I hope you guys can thrive in your leadership. God bless you.